So Lionel, thanks so much for joining us. You're the national lead in the Crown Prosecution Service for hate crime, and I know that you've got one or two other roles as well. So I would love you to start by introducing yourself and your role. And is it the case that you're the most senior Black African or Caribbean prosecutor at the CPS?
I am, Lester. So thank you for having me. I'm Lionel Idan. I'm currently the Chief Crown Prosecutor for London South. So all the boroughs in London south of the River Thames, but I've also got Westminster and a couple of others on my patch. But yes, I am the senior most Black male prosecutor in the CPS at the moment. I also, as you mentioned, hold the national lead for hate crime as well for the CPS. So those are my two key roles, you could say. One of my hidden talents is I'm quite a good artist. So I kind of thought I might go in that direction. And as I studied, completed my studies, it made sense to do a degree in something that was quite solid, like law. It could give me some options around either going to broadcasting or something else. But I remember I was fascinated by what court artists do. So I thought I'll go to the Old Bailey, observe one of the court artists at work. And it turned out I actually didn't focus at all on what the court artist was doing, but I just got caught up in what the barristers were doing, the case. And I thought, you know what, I'd love to do that job. And so at that stage, it was more of a dream. I didn't really realize the reality of it. But I thought, yeah, I really want to wear that wig and gown and, represent people. So I started to pursue that avenue, and everything seemed to be going smoothly until, of course, I qualified. And then I was seeking what we call pupillage or an apprenticeship. And in my day, most of them were unpaid, or you got paid a very paltry sum. So you would assume that there were opportunities to get these pupillages. But I must have sought, over 90 applications and no success at all. So I chose to take up something called outdoor clerking. And it's probably in the pantheon of legal things that you can do or jobs. It's the lowest of the low. I mean, I was being given files by high street solicitors to go and support barristers in court and sit behind them and take notes. And so on and so forth. But that's how I started, and I was so determined. I wanted to make it. And, for some, it might feel a bit humiliating. I qualified as a barrister, and yet here I was carrying files for other barristers. But I did it. And it was probably, I can say, one of the best experiences I ever did in my life, because firstly, I learned humility, but also just observing other people time and time again on their feet. I learned so much. I learned what good looked like, what bad looked like. And I think by the time I was on my feet myself, I was so well prepared. And it was actually through that route, just supporting other barristers, that I met barristers who said, apply to my chambers. And I got a chance to practice. So that's how I made my first start at the bar. And then I used to prosecute and defend initially in crime. But at some point, for anyone who's ever done both, defending and prosecuting, I certainly started to feel a natural affinity for prosecuting, simply because of the contact I was having with victims of crime. So I joined the CPS, as I said, in 2005. About a year in, I had no ambitions at that stage to become a manager or a leader at all. I was just focused on being the best barrister within the CPS I could be. But I remember about a year in, a Black manager actually approached me and said, they'd observed me in my interactions with people, what I did. And for the first time, they suggested, had I ever considered becoming a manager? And they pointed out a few personal qualities that they felt I had. And that was the first trigger, the first time anyone had suggested some sort of leadership path or career. And I took it very seriously, because it was somebody who had taken time to pull me to one side and talk to me in that way. And so, of course, when the opportunity came up, I applied to become, in CPS terms, a first-tier manager, managing lawyers. And I was successful, so I took that role, and then in due course in 2009, I applied to become the next tier above, so overseeing 6 boroughs in London. I was successful, so I got that role. It was when I then applied, or I wanted to move on to the next tier, which was a Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor, one step beneath the role I've got. I think that's where I experienced in my world what I felt was that glass ceiling, because I made a number of applications that were not successful, but I stuck at it. I stayed determined, I persevered, and eventually I got a role as a Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor in the West Midlands, probably the largest region in the country, CPS-wise.
Just looking at hate crime itself, we've just seen the Home Office statistics showing a 12% rise in race hate crime and 9% rise in hate crime overall. That's quite large. That's on top of previous spikes that we've seen. It feels like we're in very worrying times when it comes to race hate. So we're reporting on incidences and stories all the time. What do you think is really behind this? Is this just the era that we happen to be living in, or what kind of factors explain it? And just a sort of secondary question to that. I mean, the Home Office were suggesting that it was the Black Lives Matter protests and the far-right counter-protests that were partly explained these statistics, and some people took exception to that and actually said, well, actually, you need to make it very, very clear that if you're talking about Black Lives Matter, they are entirely blameless. They have not generated race hate crimes. If there have been any race hate crimes, it's been the counter reaction to them, and that many people felt was not made particularly clear. I don't know if you've got anything to say about that, but certainly in relation to hate crime itself, do you think this is a trend that is continuing to go upwards, and how worried are you about this?
I think, Lester, there's so many underlying factors when it comes to hate crime. It could be the climate we live in. It could be trigger factors you've just touched upon. It's a very difficult thing to say, to try and pin down. For me, as I mentioned, being in the West Midlands, a large region, being in London now, it's always been there. It's always persisted. And in a sense, while on the one hand, it might seem worrying, obviously, that we've got more reports. On the other hand, it's quite a positive thing that people feel empowered, confident enough to report it, because in my role, that's one of the concerns I always have, that there is, or there might be, a lack of confidence in the system or in the response that there might be to hate crime, that victims won't feel able to come forward. So on one hand, in one sense, that's a positive for me. But look, we take hate crime very, very seriously. It's something that is so abhorrent. I mean, anyone who's been the victim of hate crime knows it's not just the impact on you as the victim, it's your wider community, but also other communities who suffer from hate crime feel it as well. So yeah, it's something we take very seriously. I'm working very closely in my role with the National Police Chiefs Council to try and make sure that we are trying to respond to this and we are trying to tackle it. And I don't want to necessarily throw facts and figures at you, but whenever we get convictions, we go after harsher sentences. We apply for harsher sentences. And
what's the prosecution rate at the moment for hate crime? So, for people who report hate crime, what percentage of those people actually see the perpetrator convicted?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example just between 2020 and 2021, perhaps as most recent as possible. We managed to prosecute something like 10,679 hate crimes, and in 86% of those, the defendant either pleaded guilty or was found guilty of one or more crimes. So it's quite a high, conviction rate, you could say. And of those 86% cases, 79.1% of those, the courts passing sentence passed harsher sentences. So yeah, it's when we do get people, we do get them convicted, and we do prosecute those.
Absolutely. And of course, there's different types of race hate crime as well. It manifests itself in different ways. You've got Islamophobia, for example. Do you think there's enough consideration given for anti-Black racism, or Afrophobia, as some people call it?
Absolutely. I think if you look generally at the different strands, certainly race hate crime, it's one that the figures are, I don't have them to hand, but we certainly prosecute a lot more race hate crime. And absolutely, it's really abhorrent. As I said to you at the beginning, it's an attack on your core, who you are. So yeah, of course, a lot of priority is given to that. A lot of spotlight is shone on it. And I think, again, it's around building that trust and confidence. We know, whether we like it or not, the trust and confidence among some of our communities, our Black community, it's quite low when it comes to the criminal justice system or agencies within the system. So that's a key part, to try and build back that trust and confidence. But absolutely, we take it so seriously, of course.
When somebody comes forward and says that this incident or this abuse that they've suffered is because they are African or Caribbean, as opposed to another person of colour, from the Indian subcontinent
Yes.
or the Far East or so on, is that specifically recognised by the CPS? Is that monitored so that you're really keeping a track on different types of race discrimination that are and race hate that's actually happening? Particularly when it is felt that it's motivated but by that particular dynamic.
Yeah. And I'll give you a quick example. If you take recent events in football, which were targeting Black players in particular, you should see how importantly we've taken it, the priority that's been shone on that. No one, whether you're in football or outside the stadium or online, should be subjected to the sort of racist, and I won't repeat some of the words that were used and some of the comments and gestures towards Black people. It's completely abhorrent. So, of course, I don't want to quote names to you, but you may have heard of Tariq Wright. He's a footballer who was playing for Aston Villa at the time. Just last week, 7th of October, we've convicted his abuser online. Those who abused the three lions, we've convicted at least 2 so far. There's another player who plays for West Bromwich. Again, his attacker was just convicted, got a term of imprisonment. We take these race hate crimes against Black people, against everyone, but Black people, very, very seriously indeed. It's so damaging.
Those convictions are, of course, good news that those perpetrators have been brought to justice. But some people would say that's really a drop in the ocean when it comes to social media abuse. We've heard from the likes of Troy Deeney of Birmingham City, used to be a Watford legend, and other players who are actually describing the volume of race hate they actually get on social media. I think it was Troy Deeney that was saying that sometimes it's actually 20 or 30 abusive posts a day that he receives. I mean, the volume is absolutely incredible. It's great that the CPS are prosecuting where you can, but there's also a responsibility, isn't there, on the social media companies, those platforms, to take action. And are there going to be some prosecutions of Twitter or Facebook or some of those other platforms for facilitating this race hate?
Yeah, I know, and again, the police investigate these offences. I know the tremendous amount of work they're doing with the social media companies, with football organisations, with clubs, with Kick It Out. We've even had Alan Bush from Kick It Out come in and speak to our staff and shed some light on what's going on. To give you an example, Leicester, my team, I think a few months ago, run a workshop with West Ham Football Club. So yeah, not just football, but generally we take these things very seriously. And you're right, there is a plethora of it going on, but there are also, and the police are doing a tremendous job, as I mentioned, but there are some barriers. If an account, as an example, you cannot pin down who owns the account, that's a difficulty. There are often occasions when these accounts are abroad, overseas, which is appalling, but that's the nature of some of these incidents. So you've got some of these challenges to overcome in the first place. But I know personally and professionally some of the tremendous work going on to try and work with the league, work with Sky, for example, work with other organizations to try and root this sort of thing out and, try and ban people, try and uncover who sits behind that keyboard and sends those really abhorrent and abusive comments and gestures. So there is a lot of work going on, but you're right, there is much more that can be done, of course.
So is there going to be a stepping up of action? Because you've described the action being taken so far, but are we going to see another wave of action being taken by the CPS and by other authorities that you're working with?
Of course, and I hope I didn't give you the impression that these are just one-off moments in time. Of course not. The police continue to investigate these incidents. Of course, I can't talk about any cases that might or might not be in the pipeline, but this is an ongoing approach, an ongoing response to something that is completely unacceptable, whether it's online, whether it's in person. So I don't necessarily think that you'll see this is just a blip and, then just disappears into the ether. It's an ongoing response that we've got towards racist hate crime, whether it's football related or otherwise, ongoing.
Thanks so much. I know we're slightly short of time, so I just want to, I'm going to come on to black representation in just a second, but just to deal with the last the question I've got in relation to hate crime, which is in relation to the media, in relation to newspapers, because there are two parts to this, I guess. One is that people have been appalled, for example, at the treatment of Meghan and Harry by the newspapers, and everyone seems to have got away with that. Now the trouble is that some people who stir things up manage to stay the right side of the line, I guess, and therefore they seem to escape action. But yet the climate is being built up, many people would say, of hate that actually that couple themselves have actually spoken about what they perceive to be the risks to their life and limb. So I don't know if you've got any comments on that, but also in relation to newspapers, I mean, there's also a frustration that the regulation of newspapers is just simply not good enough, that the code, the IPSO code still remains, ultimately voluntary, and that there's this definition between, the individual, there's an emphasis on the individual having some rights, but actually, the community as a whole not having rights. So, if you are, targeted in the media as an individual, then you've got some recourse. But if you see something which in a newspaper or in a media outlet that appears to target your race or your community, but not you in particular, then that seems to be okay. There seems to be a green light for that type of thing. So, can you tell me what your feelings are in relation to combating race hate? Because we're talking really about some of the underlying currents that may be driving the kind of race hate crimes that we've talked about already. In relation to Meghan and Harry, we've got a comment there, and also about newspaper regulation, media regulation as well.
Yeah, what I would say, Lester, is, no, and I said this last week publicly, no one, whoever you are, whatever you do, no one should ever be at risk of being targeted simply because of who they are. And that's absolutely devastating for any individual, absolutely. So, yeah, for me, as hate crime lead, as an organization, we will prosecute perpetrators of hate crime. If you commit a crime and you are motivated to do it, or you demonstrate hostility in doing it, of course we'll prosecute you. I won't go into too much detail around the code. It's a publicly accessible document, but where there is sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction, absolutely, we will prosecute people. So I don't want to stray necessarily into perhaps conjecture or things that may not be real crimes or cases. It would be wrong for me to do so. But the assurance I do want to give is that where our code is met, we will prosecute people who attack people because of who they are, whether it's online, whether it's in person, whether it's race crime, whether it's homophobia, transphobia, all strands, disability, hate crime. We will prosecute people if they commit that crime.
Well, many people say there's a long way to go as far as the media is concerned. But anyway, let's we move on from that. Is the CPS institutionally racist?
I mean, look, if you go back to the Macpherson inquiry, the CPS was found to be institutionally racist, I think, in 2000, and a hell of a lot of work has taken place over the course of however many years to make sure we are not. So for us, inclusion, diversity, and community engagement, which is key as well, lie at the heart of everything we do, whether it's how we prosecute cases, how we recruit. And just on the 27th of September, we've published our 2025 Inclusion, Engagement and Diversity Strategy, which sets out how we are going to become so much more diverse and inclusive than we are, whether it's internally, whether it's externally, how we attract people from communities that ought to reflect who we are. So, yeah, at our heart, at the heart of what we do, everything we do, we have moved so far from where we were when the Macpherson report came out. And I hope to some extent I'm living proof that that's changing. And, you know, if you ever look at our campaigns now to attract people from the Black community, from the Asian community, it's a different ball game. You know, we put diversity at the forefront of how we recruit. So, yeah, I think we've moved a long way from where we were, 20 years ago.
So just finally, your advice to budding potential lawyers that are looking at looking at this interview, and what would be your advice to them?
I think, look, the first thing to be realistic about is you will have challenges. There's no doubt about it. It happens whether in your professional life, whether you walk into court and sometimes you might be mistaken for the defendant, which it's happened to me before, or the family of the defendant. There'll be challenges along the way. But the one thing I can say from personal experience, persevere, don't give up. If when I couldn't get my pupillage, I'd quit and become something else, I wouldn't be here. Sometimes you might have to take a different road. So I took the outdoor clerking. I had to humble myself, stick at it, be determined. If you really want something, embrace the idea that you will have to work 3 times as hard. I've had to. You will have to make sacrifices. I left London to take up a role in the West Midlands. I'd practiced all my life in London, but stick at it, persevere, hard work, and seek out people like myself, like Lester, other people who can have a chat with you and just pick you up in that moment that you might be struggling. But the one thing I can say to you is, from my experience, that glass ceiling can be broken. So stick at it, persevere.